courtroom remained in a stunned silence long after Judge Sterling had stormed out, his gavel strike still echoing faintly in the ears of those present. Conversations broke out in hushed whispers among the spectators, but Ava Maxwell remained seated at the defense table, her expression calm and composed. She had weathered storms far more intense than this one. Beside her, David sat silently, his eyes fixed on her as though searching for reassurance. "Angie," he said quietly, leaning toward her, "you really shook him. I've never seen a judge look so rattled in my life." Ava didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for a glass of water on the table, her movement measured and deliberate. She took a small sip before setting it down again. Only then did she turn to her brother, her voice soft but firm. "This isn't about rattling him, David. It's about exposing the truth. And truth has a way of making the arrogant uncomfortable." David nodded, but his unease was still evident. "Do you think it's enough? Do you think he'll actually listen?" Ava's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a small crack in her otherwise stoic exterior. "Judges, like Sterling, don't listen, David. They react. And when they're cornered, they either double down or crumble under the weight of their own hubris. Either way, we're ready." The recess stretched on longer than anyone expected. Outside the courtroom doors, the corridors of the King County Courthouse buzzed with activity. Reporters who had initially paid little attention to the case were now gathered in clusters, their notebooks and cameras at the ready. News of Ava's revelation had spread like wildfire, and the courthouse had become a hive of speculation. Ava remained seated at the defense table, her back straight, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. She didn't flinch under the curious stares of the onlookers who had lingered in the gallery. Some looked at her with admiration, others with skepticism. But none could ignore the quiet authority she exuded. Finally, the heavy double doors opened, and the bailiff's voice boomed. "All rise! Court is back in session." Ava stood slowly, her movements deliberate. Beside her, David rose as well, his breathing steady but shallow. Judge Sterling entered the room, his face flushed but his expression tightly controlled. If the recess had given him time to collect himself, it was clear he still hadn't regained the full confidence he had wielded earlier. He took his seat, his gavel clutched tightly in one hand. For a moment he simply sat there, his gaze sweeping the room as though daring anyone to challenge his authority. But the cracks in his demeanor were evident. A slight tremor in his hand, a tightness around his mouth. Ava saw it all. "Before we proceed," Judge Sterling began, his voice carefully measured, "I feel it necessary to remind this court of the rules of decorum. While Agent Maxwell's credentials are notable, they do not grant her immunity from the standards of conduct expected in this courtroom." Ava met his gaze evenly, her expression unchanging. She said nothing, allowing the weight of her silence to settle over the room. It wasn't defiance, it was control. And it unnerved the judge more than any outburst ever could. Prosecutor Ellis took the opportunity to jump in. "Your Honor," he began, rising to his feet, "I'd like to request that we refocus on the facts of this case. Agent Maxwell's testimony, while compelling, is ultimately irrelevant to the charges at hand." Ava's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She knew this tactic well: minimize, redirect, diminish. It was the playbook of those who felt their power slipping, but she also knew that facts had a way of cutting through even the thickest veil of arrogance. The defense attorney, emboldened by Ava's presence, rose to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firmer than before, "Agent Maxwell's testimony is not only relevant, it's critical. The video evidence she reviewed, the witnesses she spoke to, these are not just opinions, they are verifiable truths that this court has a duty to consider." Judge Sterling sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "Enough!" he snapped, his voice cracking slightly. "We will review the evidence once more, but I will not allow this court to devolve into a spectacle." The bailiff stepped forward, loading the video evidence onto the courtroom's projector. The screen flickered to life, displaying the grainy footage of David's arrest. Ava watched closely, her eyes scanning every frame, even though she had already memorized every detail. The video was damning, not against David, but against the officer who had escalated the situation without cause. The courtroom fell silent as the video played, the sound of the officer's harsh commands and David's calm responses echoing in the room. The moment when David was shoved to the ground played in slow motion, his body hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. Gasps rippled through the spectators, followed by uneasy murmurs. Ava glanced toward the jury, noting the shifting expressions on their faces. Doubt, unease, even guilt. The truth was beginning to break through. When the video ended, Judge Sterling leaned forward, his hands folded tightly in front of him. "The evidence is clear," he said, his voice strained, "but this does not excuse the defendant's actions." Ava rose from her seat, her movements slow and deliberate. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "The evidence does not just excuse my brother's actions. It exonerates him. What this court has witnessed today is not just the truth, but the reality of a system that fails to uphold justice for everyone." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The spectators sat in silence, the weight of her statement pressing down on them like a stone. Judge Sterling's face darkened, his hands clenching the edge of his bench. "Agent Maxwell," he said, his tone icy, "you are walking a fine line." Ava stepped closer, her gaze locked on his. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm walking the only line that matters, the line of truth." The courtroom erupted into whispers, the tension reaching a boiling point. Judge Sterling banged his gavel, the sound sharp and jarring. "Order," he barked, his voice trembling. "I will have order in my courtroom." But the authority in his voice was gone, replaced by desperation. Ava returned to her seat, her expression calm but resolute. She had done what she came to do. Now it was up to the system to decide whether it would rise to the challenge or crumble under the weight of its own failures. The judge's gavel fell once more, but this time it felt less like a declaration of authority and more like the desperate act of a man trying to maintain control of a crumbling facade. As the court adjourned for the day, Ava placed her hand on David's shoulder. "This isn't the end," she said quietly, "but we're closer than we've ever been." David nodded, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that justice might actually be within reach. And as the courtroom doors closed behind them, Ava knew that the fight was far from over. But she was ready for whatever came next. The system had been put on trial, and its flaws laid bare. Now, the verdict of public consciousness, and eventually, the jury's decision, would reveal just how much light could penetrate the darkness. The wait was excruciating. Hours passed, the hands of the clock in the courtroom ticking forward with an almost mocking slowness. Ava Maxwell sat beside her brother David at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her composure was unshaken, but inwardly, her mind was alive with possibilities. She knew better than to predict an outcome, especially one as precarious as this. The system didn't favor truth, it favored those who controlled the narrative. And for so long, Judge Sterling and men like him had controlled it. David shifted beside her, the weight of uncertainty heavy on his broad shoulders. "Angie," he whispered, breaking the silence, "what if this doesn't go our way?" Ava turned to him, her gaze steady and calm. "If it doesn't," she said softly, "we keep fighting. This case is just one battle, David. The war for justice is bigger than this room, bigger than this verdict. You're not alone in this." Her words weren't just for him. They were for herself as well. She needed to believe in the resilience of truth, even in a system designed to suppress it. Finally, the bailiff opened the door and stepped into the courtroom. "All rise," he called, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The jury has reached a verdict." The spectators shuffled to their feet, the air thick with anticipation. Ava rose slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer. David stood beside her, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Ava placed a steadying hand on his arm, grounding him. Judge Sterling entered the room, his expression carefully neutral, but Ava noticed a slight stiffness in his movements, the way his eyes avoided meeting hers as he took his seat. The gavel struck the desk with a sharp crack, and the courtroom fell silent. "Be seated," Judge Sterling commanded. The room obeyed in unison, the creak of wooden benches filling the silence. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a nervous demeanor, stood. In her hands, she held a folded piece of paper that seemed impossibly small for the weight it carried. She cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Your Honor," she began, "the jury has reached a unanimous decision." Ava's heart beat steadily, her calm exterior masking the storm of emotions beneath. She glanced at David, who was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched tightly. This was it, the moment that would determine not just his fate, but a small piece of justice in a system that had failed so many. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Sterling instructed, his voice devoid of emotion. David stood, his large frame somehow looking smaller under the weight of the judge's gaze. Ava rose beside him, her presence a quiet but powerful show of solidarity. The foreman unfolded the paper, her hands shaking slightly. She glanced at David, then at the judge, before finally reading aloud. "On the charge of resisting arrest," she said, her voice trembling, "we find the defendant, David Monroe, not guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment, as if the room itself needed time to process them. Then, like a dam breaking, a wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. Some gasped in relief, others in disbelief. Ava closed her eyes for the briefest moment, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Beside her, David's knees buckled slightly, and she steadied him with the firm hand on his arm. "Order!" Judge Sterling barked, banging his gavel. "I will have order in this courtroom." The noise subsided, but the tension didn't. The judge's face was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced at Ava, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Resentment, perhaps, or the sting of being outmaneuvered. Either way, she held his gaze without flinching. "The defendant is free to go," Sterling said curtly, the words forced through gritted teeth. "This court is adjourned." He struck the gavel one final time and rose, his robe billowing as he left the room without another word. The courtroom erupted as soon as the judge was gone. David turned to Ava, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Angie," he whispered, his voice cracking, "we did it." "No," Ava said softly, her expression warm but resolute. "You did it, the truth. Did it." He pulled her into a tight embrace, his shoulders shaking as weeks of tension finally gave way to relief. Ava held him, her arms strong and steady, a quiet anchor in the storm around them. Reporters began to swarm, their cameras flashing, their questions flying. Ava ignored them, her focus entirely on her brother. This wasn't their moment to exploit. It was David's moment to reclaim his dignity, his humanity, and his life. As they left the courthouse, the cool King County air hit them like a bomb. The noise of the crowd followed them outside, but Ava guided David toward a quieter corner of the steps. She turned to him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. "This isn't the end, David," she said, her voice firm but kind. "This is just the beginning. What happened to you isn't unique, it's systemic. And we can't stop here. We have to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." David nodded, his expression a mixture of gratitude and determination. "I'll do whatever it takes, Angie. I'll fight just like you." Ava smiled, a rare softness in her otherwise guarded demeanor. "You've already fought, David, and you've already won." She glanced back at the courthouse. its imposing structure standing as a reminder of the battles yet to come. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, a moment to breathe, knowing that they had taken one small but significant step toward justice. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the city in shades of gold and crimson, Ava Maxwell walked away from the courthouse with her brother by her side, ready for whatever came next. The verdict was in, but the real work, the enduring fight, was just beginning. Months later, Ava sat in her modest but neatly kept apartment, reviewing documents spread across her dining table. The case against Officer Jenkins, the one who had unjustly arrested David, had gained traction in the wake of David's acquittal, spurred by public outrage and the undeniable video evidence presented in court. Activists, legal scholars, and even some lawmakers had taken notice, calling for deeper investigations into systemic biases in the justice system. This wasn't just a local news story anymore. It was becoming a national conversation. Ava had quietly stepped into a role she hadn't anticipated, an advocate, not just for her brother, but for countless others who had been wronged by a flawed system. Her Secret Service training, once solely focused on physical protection and intelligence gathering, now informed her strategic approach to social change. She balanced her demanding work as a special agent with her newfound mission. Often working late into the night, she found herself speaking at community forums, her calm, authoritative voice resonating with audiences hungry for truth and accountability. She met with legal reform organizations, lending her unique perspective from inside the system, advising on strategies to push for meaningful policy changes, such as mandatory body camera policies, enhanced de-escalation training for law enforcement, and the implementation of independent civilian oversight boards. She lent her voice to the growing demand for accountability, emphasizing that badges carried not just authority, but a commitment to truth, fairness, and the rule of law. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention from the papers. It was David. "Hey, Angie," he said, his voice carrying a new lightness she hadn't heard in years. "I just wanted to let you know. I spoke at a youth center today. Told my story. A lot of those kids, they're going through what I went through. I think it made a difference." Ava smiled, pride swelling in her chest. "That's amazing, David. I'm proud of you." "You should have seen their faces," he continued. "I told them what you told me, that the fight isn't over, but that doesn't mean we stop fighting." This was the ripple effect Ava had hoped for. David's story, once a crushing burden, had become a powerful beacon of hope. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving, using his experience to prevent others from falling into the same traps. His vulnerability had transformed into strength, his pain into purpose. They talked for a few more minutes before hanging up, and Ava sat in the quiet of her apartment, her thoughts drifting. The road ahead was long, filled with battles yet to be fought. She knew there would be resistance, pushback from those who benefited from the status quo. There would be moments of weariness, of doubt, of juggling the immense responsibilities of her dual life. But moments like this, hearing David's renewed spirit, reminded her why she kept going. The victory in David's courtroom was just one battle, a single crack in a formidable wall. But it proved the wall could be cracked, and with every person who spoke out, every policy that shifted, every mind that opened, those cracks would widen until one day, perhaps, the wall would finally crumble. The echo of truth, once a whisper, was growing into a roar, and Ava was at its heart. Weeks later, Ava stood at the front of a packed auditorium, the bright lights of the stage casting her in sharp relief. The room was filled with community members, lawyers, students, and activists, all gathered for a panel on systemic reform. Ava had been invited to speak not solely as an agent of the Secret Service, but as a sister, a witness, and a warrior for justice. She stepped up to the podium, the crowd falling silent as she began. "Justice is not a guarantee," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "It is something we have to fight for, something we have to demand. Her brother's story, now shared widely, was a stark reminder. David's unjust arrest, the arrogance of Judge Sterling, the blatant disregard for truth, these were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper issue, threads in a complex tapestry of systemic bias that had for far too long dictated outcomes for countless individuals who looked like David. My brother's story is just one of many, Ava continued, but it's a reminder that when we stand together, when we refuse to be silenced, change is possible. She paused, letting the words sink in. The fight was immense, the forces of inertia powerful. There were days in the quiet solitude of her apartment after a grueling Secret Service operation when the weight of it all felt crushing. The endless meetings, the slow pace of policy change, the resistance from entrenched interests. It was a different kind of battle than the high-stakes protection details she was used to, but no less exhausting. Yet, the persistent image of David's face, radiant with relief after the verdict, fueled her. The voices of the young people David spoke to, who saw their own struggles reflected in his story, resonated deeply. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about laying the groundwork for a future where a badge genuinely meant a commitment to truth and fairness for all, not just for some. This isn't just about David, or about me, she articulated, her gaze sweeping the room. It's about every person who has been silenced, dismissed, or wrongfully judged. It's about building a system that values humanity over bias, truth over power. The crowd erupted into applause, a swelling tide of agreement and hope. But Ava remained still, her gaze sweeping the room. She felt the weight of her words, the responsibility they carried. And yet she also felt hope, a quiet but persistent hope that things could change, that the ripples of this moment could grow into waves. As she stepped back from the podium, the applause swelling around her, Ava knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. She had found her purpose not just in protecting others, but in standing up for what was right, in dismantling the very structures that perpetuated injustice. And as the crowd rose to their feet, their voices joining together in a chorus of support, Ava Maxwell walked off the stage, her head held high, ready to face whatever came next. The chapters of this fight were still being written, but with every step she took, with every voice she amplified, she was crafting a legacy of unyielding spirit, ensuring that the echo of truth would never fade. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think, made you feel, then please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the incredible human spirit. Your support helps us amplify these crucial stories. Thank you for listening.